Watching you on the Russian TV, I came to this amazing story about who is really ruling the world, the big corporates. The man is doing his confession and gave some data
Hitman.
which really,
So now to
really
talk about his
astonished me. So
experience as an
I'm
economic hitman,
proceeding
making
it
the
to
rich
you to
richer, the poor
have a
poor,
look at
and the
it.
grave
Thank you.
implications that follow, I'm joined by the author himself, economist John Perkins. John, thanks so much for coming on.
It's great to be with you, Abby. Thank you.
So for people who haven't read the book, who don't know who you are, tell our audience just really straightforward, what is an economic hitman?
Well, I think it's safe to say that economic hitmen have created the world's first truly global empire. And it's the first empire created primarily without the military. And it's not a national empire. It's not an American empire. It's really a corporate empire created by economic hitmen like me. We work many different ways, but perhaps the most common is that we will identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, arrange huge loans to that country from the World Bank and other international banks, but the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in those countries, like power plants, industrial parks, things that benefit a few wealthy families, but don't help the poor, who are too poor to buy electricity, can't get jobs in industrial parks because they don't hire many people. And yet they are left holding a huge debt that they can't possibly repay. So at some point we go back and say, hey, you can't pay your debt, so sell your oil or whatever the resource is real cheap to our corporations. Allow us to build a military base on your soil, that sort of thing. And in the few cases where we fail, where the governments don't agree to these terms, the jackals go in. And these are people that either overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. And I talk in my books about how I failed with the president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, and of Panama, Omar Torrijos. And because they wouldn't buy into these deals, both of them were assassinated.
And of course, the IMF and World Bank are used as tools for the economic hitman to go in and keep these debts going with these countries. What entities? You just said that it's not the United States, it's the corporate control, it's the corporate empire. What entities are involved in this operation? I mean, are we just talking about corporations facilitating these deals, or are they working in concert with governments?
I think we've come to a point, Abby, in history where corporations really control the governments.
Right.
We know that nobody gets elected to a major position in the United States without huge corporate support, and then they basically become servants to the corporations. It isn't their fault. It isn't Obama's fault that he now has to bring in people who are very friendly to corporations to watchdog those very corporations. He wouldn't be president if he didn't do that. So really today we've gone from a point where 200, 300 years ago, religious organizations call the shots around the world, to ones where governments call the shots for some time, and now it's the corporations that are calling the shots in various different ways. There's this revolving door, so there's really no separation between corporations and government at the very highest levels. The leaders bounce back and forth between the two.
John, you mentioned Ecuador. I want you to talk more extensively about what happened there and why the jackals needed to come in.
Well, Ecuador had been under the leadership of military dictators for a number of years, men put into office by the CIA and kept there by the CIA. And then there was kind of a revolution, a democratic revolution in Ecuador, and they democratically voted in this president, Jaime Roldos. This is back in the 70s. And Jaime ran on a ticket that said he was going to clamp down on the oil companies. He wanted them to continue drilling for oil, but they had to give a bigger share of their profits to the people. We didn't like that. And so my job and that of other economic hitmen was to convince Jaime to do differently. He didn't. He wouldn't be convinced. He had great integrity. He stuck to his guns, and so he was assassinated.
And I saw you in another interview. You were talking about Iraq. What steps were efforted there? It was kind of like Iraq was a case where everything was tried, and then it ultimately ended in a ground invasion. Why did it need to end there?
Well, it's an interesting case. It's a kind of a long story. We had an amazingly successful operation in Saudi Arabia where we convinced the Saudis to buy into a deal with us whereby it's a long story. I won't go into the details, but it was extremely helpful to us and our oil companies and our big major corporations. We wanted Saddam Hussein to buy into a similar deal. Saudi Arabia was the largest producer of oil at the time. Iraq was the second largest. He wouldn't buy. Economic hitmen couldn't convince him, and the jackals went in to try to assassinate him. They couldn't. He had very good security. He had look-alike doubles. It was hard to take him out. They couldn't take him out. So there was the first invasion. And we thought that that would bring him around. He lost his military, but he still stuck to his guns. He did not give in. And, you know, to make a long story short, the second invasion came because we felt that we really had to take over Iraq.
Right. Yeah, it's amazing when you look at your work, John, and you realize what is really at play here. It kind of makes all this rhetoric completely absurd when it's really just all about the control of these resources. I mean, when you're looking at the globe right now, there's very few independent states still left that are not under the wing of Western imperialism. I mean, Iran, Syria, North Korea, Cuba. Let's just take the case of Iran. What do you think the outcome is going to be in this country?
I think we're in a very, very difficult and dangerous situation there. I was just meeting here a couple of days ago with a group of people from the Middle East and Russia who are convinced that the reason we're going after Syria and Assad is because he is the defense for Iran. So we take Syria, the next step is taking Iran. And then conceivably, we will try to take more control over Russia. That was the fear of the Russians, because Russia has a lot of oil and gas and is raising its head again. I don't know. That's conjecture. But certainly what we do know is that we see Iran as a country with tremendous resources in terms of oil and gas, and in a very crucial position, geographically speaking, and also a country that's threatening to sell oil for something other than dollars. We don't like it. That undermines our whole system of currency here, our Federal Reserve. And whenever leaders threaten to do that, as Gaddafi did, and as Saddam Hussein did, and now as the Iranians are doing, we take great exception. I don't believe that Iran is really about the nuclear issue so much as it's about a much larger geopolitical, economic issue.
Absolutely. And of course, you know, the funding of Hamas, Hezbollah, these are things that are kind of a thorn in the side of the establishment, let's say, in terms of Iran. But, you know, you've talked about the real cause of our global financial meltdown is, quote, predatory capitalism. What is that? And is there a way to have global capitalism without it being predatory?
Well, I believe there is. In fact, I went to business school in the late 60s, and it was Keynesian economics, Keynesian capitalism, which is very different. Keynesian capitalism said that corporations need to make profits and pay their investors a decent rate of return, but they also need to be good citizens and take good care of their customers and their employees, especially. A CEO would take a big cut in pay before he'd lay anybody off. That all changed in the 70s. When Milton Friedman, the Chicago School of Economics, came along and basically replaced Keynes.